you want drums that smack ass like crazy, then you came to the right spot. Because today I'm going to show you guys my top-down mixing approach and how I get my drums to cut through the mix and smack. We're going to be going over routing, drum library and sample selection, my top-down mixing approach, and then how to get your drums to cut through everything in the mix without sacrificing the clarity of the rest of the band and the vocals. So if that sounds good to you and you like the mix at the beginning of this video, then we're gonna jump into Studio One and I'm gonna show you how I like to do it.
All right, so the first thing I wanna go over is the routing out of GGD, because I think that's important. If you guys are unfamiliar with how to do that, I will show you. So within GGD, if we go to the mixer page, and this is the same for Contact as well, you can do the exact same thing in Contact if you're not using the new Modern and Massive player. But essentially, anything that's blue is going to be drums. So we've got all of our drums, then we've got our triggers right here, and then we have all of our drum buses right here that are routed to our mix bus and then out. So if we open up Modern and Massive, we can see that the kick 1, kick 2, and kick sub are all routed to stereo 1, 2, which in Studio One is my kick. So all of these three are going to my kick in Studio One. The one shot is going to the stereo 3/4, which is my kick one shot. And you can see all of that right here in Studio One. If you're not seeing that, then if you click this channel list right here at the very bottom on the left side, it'll pull up Modern and Massive. And then you click this little drop down menu right here, and then it'll show you all of your stereo outs for whatever instrument you're using. In this case, I'm using GGD's new interface, not Contact, but the same thing applies to Contact. So moving on, we have our snare top and our snare bottom both going to our snare bus right here. And then the snare one shot, which I'm not using in GGD, is routed to our one shot. Racks and floors routed to their respective channel in Studio One. So rack 1 and rack 2 are going to our racks, and then floor tom 1 and floor tom 2 are going to floors in Studio One. Sorry, you can't see that better. I don't think that I can change the size of Modern and Massive, so you just have to bear with me right now. And then hats, rides, splash, and overhead. Hats, rides, splash, and overhead are all going to their own tracks in Studio One. So we've got hats, ride, splash, overhead, and then room mono I'm not using, so it's turned down in Studio One, but that gets its own track. Room close and room far all have their own tracks as well. And for the drums, I'm using the stock setup with the Istanbul China and the Gentleman's Brass snare. So that's the routing out of GGD. Let's talk about the routing in Studio One real quick. So I have my kick and my kick one shot both going to a kick bus, snare and snare one shot going to a snare bus, racks and floor toms going to a tom bus, and hats, ride, splash, overhead all going to a cymbals bus. And I have all of my rooms going to a room bus. So if we go over to our buses over here, you can see that I've got my kick bus, my snare bus, and I have a snare sum. I'll get into that in just a second. Toms, cymbals, and rooms all going into my drum bus, which then goes to my mix bus, and then from there it goes out. The reason I have a snare sum is because right here in my effects channels, I have my kick room sample that I'm using trigger to utilize. I have my snare room sample, and then I have a snare sample on top of that. Those are all going, so the kick room and the snare room are going to my room bus, and then The snare trigger is going to the snare sum, because the snare bus is what is triggering the snare trigger, if that makes sense. So yeah, I have all of these buses routed to my drum bus, and then from there to the mix bus, and then out, like I said. So once I've got my routing done, the next thing that I like to do is I like to pick my samples. So if I turn off all of my processing on my buses and on my channels down here, then I'll show you how I kind of like to pick my samples. I usually will start with the kick, and if I play the kick without the kick sample, this is what it sounds like. And with the kick sample, which for this kick I'm using the clippy mids from GGD Power Vault. Most of the samples that I'm going to be using today are from the Slammers Power Vault. I think it was like $25 on sale or something, so if you don't have it, you should just pick it up. It's really helpful, and it has awesome samples. I'm using the clippy mids close sample, which alone sounds like that. And you can see that my kick drum is triggering this sample to play. I have the mix turned down a little bit so that my kick from GGD is mixed into the signal as well. And so again, with and without this is what it sounds like. So without the sample, and then with the sample, makes a pretty big difference. So a lot of this video is going to be that, like picking good samples to trigger with your GGD kit or whatever, with whatever kit you're using. So after I've got the kick sample, I will go through and then find a good kick room sample, and I'll show you how I trigger that. I have a send coming from my kick bus that is going to my kick room effects channel. And if you don't know how to do that, I'll show you. It's really simple. I'll just set up another one real quick. If you go to your sends and then you click add effects channel, you can see that it just added FX2. So if we solo FX2, we'll be able to hear that it's sending my kick drum to that effects channel. And I'm just going to remove this real quick because I have that kick channel that I just showed you routed to this kick room effects channel, where I have another instance of trigger, and this one is muted, so I'm using the Chesty Maple kick from Power Vaults. It's a really fat sounding kick room sample. I have that blended in with my kick drum and going to my room bus. So if we play the kick room and the kick together, this is what it sounds like. And then without the room sample, it just adds some really good depth to the kick drum. Then moving on to the snare, this is what the snare sounds like by itself with no processing. All of my processing on my snare bus is turned off right now. And before I even start mixing the snare, I want to find a good snare sample to go on top of it, because like I said, I want the drums to sound as close to finished as possible before I start to do any mixing at all. So if we go over to our snare room sample, I'm using two samples, the Sprightly Pop and the Empty Warehouse, both from Power Vaults again. And this is what those sound like individually. So that one, I like high-tuned snare drums for this kind of tight sounding mix. This isn't supposed to be a huge mix. It's supposed to be like a really tight mix. So I have the Sprightly Pop room sample and then the Empty Warehouse room sample just to add some tail. And I'm also clipping that, which I'll get into once I run you through the plugins that I'm using. And then for our snare trigger samples, I'm using the clean overtone, slightly detuned, just so that it's not creating dissonance with the actual snare that I'm using. And this is what that sounds like. Adding a nice like ring and mid body to that snare, and then the sprightly pop close, which is just all attack and transient. I have those blended together so that this is what they sound like together. And then just our snare without the samples, with the samples. And then if we play our snare sum together, you'll be able to see kind of what we've got going without any processing at all yet. So right off the bat, you can see that we have a really good sounding kick, a really good sounding snare. We haven't even mixed anything yet. And that is it for the sample selection. Now we'll get into the actual top-down mixing, starting at the drum bus. So if I turn off my drum bus, you're going to hear, turn off the effects on my drum bus, you're going to hear all of the samples that we chose, and then GGD Modern and Massive 2 as it sits completely unmixed. So without all of our effects on the drum bus, this is what it sounds like. So you can hear just with proper sample choice, we're like 80% of the way there. And now I'll turn on the drum bus so that you can hear it. So off, and then on, off. It's already sounding really good. And my drum bus is mostly, you guys, just going to be saturation and clipping. There's not a whole lot of EQ happening on this drum bus. It's just to kind of get everything to sit well together. So the first thing that I have here is Devil Lock from Sound Toys. So with and without Devil Lock, and then with. You can hear that it's kind of bringing everything a little bit more forward in the mix. It's kind of adding a nice sheen to everything. And then I have an instance of JST clip. Not doing a ton. Then one instance of standard clip, just clipping some more. You can tell that I'm just clipping those transients that are standing out. And then I have another standard clip, just clipping a little bit more. And then one more. And that is it for the drum bus. Super simple. So I'll show you one more time without. So we'll go over the room next, and I have an instance of Pro Q3, just taming some mids. So without Pro Q, and then with, and then I've got an instance of Decapitator with Punish on, the drive super low, thump on, and then the mix turned down a bit and the high cut turned down just a little bit. So with and without, without Decapitator, and then with. I was adding some grit to that room sample for sure, that room sound for sure. I find that it just makes the drum sound a little bit more aggressive. That's just kind of a taste thing. And then I've got an instance of Soothe, just I don't know what I'm doing with this, but without and then with. Honestly, this probably doesn't even need to be on here. I'm not really sure why it is. And then I've got a infinity bass from Slate Digital, and I freaking love this thing. It adds like a low end punch to the room sound that I just think sounds awesome. I was trying to figure out like how do I get more punch into my rooms without just boosting everything in the low end, and this was kind of the answer to that for me. I have it on the warm setting, the amount of about 60%, and the frequency at 90 hertz, and the character where it comes out of the box. So without infinity bass, and then with. It's adding quite a bit of punch to that low end of that room, as you can hear, something that I really love to do. Moving on to our cymbals, I've just got an instance of Decapitator and an EQ. We'll solo out the cymbals real quick. And then with Decapitator on, I'm basically adding a little bit of distortion and then some brightness to the tone on the P-style distortion with the mix turned down a little bit. And after that, I've got an EQ, cutting the lows, getting rid of some stick attack, and then adding a little bit of air without the EQ. This is what it sounds like. And then with. Moving on to our toms, I have a gate on these toms just to get rid of any unwanted tail on those toms. I think there's a fill right here. And then if we turn on the gate, and then I've got an EQ, taming some lows, cutting some mids, adding a little bit of stick attack, and then some transient at the very top. So without, and then with. And then on our snare sum, I'm clipping it and then adding an EQ. So if we go to the clip, oops, wrong one. With the clip, adding a little bit of brightness and just a little bit of clipping. And then if we go to the EQ, I'm just taming probably like, yeah, just a little bit of ring. I'm just taming. I'm not cutting it out. If you guys cut out a lot of that, the ringing from the snare, you'll end up with a really nasally sounding snare that just doesn't sound super great to me. So I'm just cutting a little bit, just a little bit under 2 dBs of that ringing. And then on our snare bus, we've got another instance of clip. Just clipping a tiny bit, a little bit more EQ, adding some body, cutting some mids, and then some attack. So without the EQ. And then with. And then an instance of smash and grab, just adding a little bit of transient to the snare so it cuts through a little bit more. With. and then with. It just kind of gives this like gravelly sort of attack to the kick that I really like. And then I've got a Pro Q, just cutting some mids, a little bit of the click, and taming the super low end. So without the EQ, it sounds like this. And then with. Cool. So let's play this without any of our bus processing. And then with. So you can hear that all of the moves that I'm making with my effects, they're really small moves because I kind of know what the sound is that I'm after. And I'm just using really small moves to get there. It's not super complicated. I try to avoid making huge drastic changes. And then from there, I'm sending quite a bit of kick, snare, little bit of toms, and then a tiny bit of cymbals and a lot of room to a parallel compression channel that sounds like this. With decapitator and smash and grab, it's pretty low, it's pretty subtle, but this is what it sounds like. That is decapitator on the E-type with the drive at 5, and everything else pretty much where it comes stock out of the box. So without decapitator. And then an instance of smash and grab just to add a little bit of pump to that parallel compression channel. And I just have that blended into the drum signal. So if we mute that parallel compression track, this is what it sounds like. And then with. Just adding a little bit of attack for the kick and for the snare. And then if we go to our drum channels down here, you can see I have nothing on the rooms, nothing on the overhead, nothing on the splash ride, the hi-hat, or sorry, I do have a little bit of EQ on the hi-hat. So if I solo the hi-hat, this is what it sounds like without. And then with. I'm not really sure what those moves are for, but it sounded good in the context of the mix, so I went with it. And then the rack and the floor toms have the exact same EQ on both of them, which is boosting some lows, cutting some mids, and adding a bunch of stick attack at the top right here. So if I play the toms by themselves, this is what it sounds like without our processing. And then with. And then for the kick, I've got a Pro Q, just scooping a fuckload of mids apparently, and boosting a little bit of that 1700. I find that transient really lends itself well to the kind of clipping that I do, and gives it that really kind of like squishy, gravelly sort of attack. So without. And then with. And then I've got an instance of JST clip, adding a little bit of clipping. So without that. And then with. So this is with everything that we've done so far. I think next it would make sense to start talking about the mix bus, because I have this mix bus turned on the whole time I'm mixing. Every effect on here, it's in the mix template that I use, that I've developed over like the last couple months probably for this style of mix. And I'll go through that, just kind of plug in by plug in so that you can see how much that's adding. And this is what it sounds like without it. And then with. You can hear it's adding some volume, but it's also adding a lot of clarity, and it's taming the low end quite a bit, and it's adding quite a bit of punch as well. So let's go through the mix bus one plugin at a time. I'm starting with Saturn, and I'm using this basically as a tape emulation. So the drive is turned down to 20%. The input gain is turned down 25 dBs, and the output gain is turned up 25 dBs. And I'll show you what that sounds like. So without Saturn, and then with. So you can hear it's adding some saturation there. That I don't know, it just adds a nice sheen over everything, and it's kind of this really musical sounding saturation. It tightens up the low end a bit. I'm sorry, my dogs are barking. I don't know if the mailman's here or what, but. So moving on, we've got a VBC FG Gray with these nollie settings, fast attack, fast release, and dialing in the threshold to just kind of grab the highest peaks of the snare, with the ratio on 4 and the high pass turned all the way up to 150. So this is what it sounds like without. And then with. You can see that we're catching about 3 dBs of the snare, and it's just kind of making it a little bit less pokey and shoving it down into the mix a little bit better. Super subtle, but I think it makes a huge difference. So one more time without. And then with. And then I've got an instance of Pro MB just clamping down on the sub of the kick a little bit. So without. And then with. Then I've got an instance of standard clip, probably just clipping a little bit of the transient, so without standard clip. And then I've got a bus compressor, just adding a little bit of glue. This isn't gonna sound too much different with just the drums playing, but when you add the instruments in, it makes a pretty big difference. And this is just kind of a taste thing for this style of mix. I want a little bit of pump from the kick, so I've got this bus comp on here, just barely kissing the mix. So let's hear what that sounds like before and after. So without. And then I've got a Pro Q. This is probably a mix thing, not necessarily a drum thing, just adding a little bit of brightness, a little bit of low end. So without. Adding a little bit of clarity to everything. This is probably something specific to this mix, but typically what I'll do is have this kind of tilt EQ, adding a little bit of brightness and taming the lows a little bit. And then last but not least, I've got an instance of Mo TT, which is upward and downward compression. So anything that's quiet, it'll be boosting those levels up, and anything that's loud, it'll be clamping down on that stuff as well. And I always have the mix on this super low. This will probably be pretty subtle too, but without Mo TT. And then with. So you can hear that's making a pretty big difference as well. And I really like OTT style compressors for that reason. It just adds so much excitement to your mix, and yeah, I use that on literally again everything. So that's pretty much it for the mix bus. My master bus just has another clipper and a limiter just to add some volume, and I always run this spectrometer just so that I can see what everything is doing. Super helpful tool to have. So that is basically the entire drum mix, but there's one more thing that we need to do to bring it to the next level, and that is sidechain compression. But I'm not using a compressor to trigger the sidechain, or excuse me, I'm not using a compressor as my sidechain compression, if that makes sense. I'm using Soothe. And a lot of people are doing this now, and it's a really, really awesome trick if you guys are trying to get that kick to cut through the mix a little bit more. You can apply this to vocals and to your snare as well even, but I have an instance of Soothe on the instrument bus with the depth all the way up, the selectivity at about 3.5, and on fast attack and release on the hard setting with the depth turned all the way up. So if we disable Soothe, this is going to show you kind of how the transient and the sub of the kick is going to get buried in the mix. And then when I turn Soothe on, that sub is going to punch through everything. Because Soothe is what's called a dynamic EQ. It's not a regular EQ like your Pro Q, where you increase a band and it increases everything in that band. Soothe, you can think of it as like those bands are constantly moving. So like if you have your instrument channel or your instrument bus and then your kick bus, when you increase them both together, they are going to clash a little bit. Traditional sidechain compression is going to push everything down when the kick hits, but Soothe is going to only push the relevant information from the kick through everything else. So it's a really useful tool to have. Without Soothe, this is what it sounds like. Let's go to a more aggressive part. And then with that's pretty subtle, but it makes a huge difference, especially when you start cranking shit up and turning it up really loud. That sub cuts through everything in an awesome way, and that's basically on my instrument track, always through everything. All these moves that I made today they're all subtle, but I hope that you can see that this top-down mixing approach, it saves you a lot of headache later down the line. When you start mixing your kick and then you mix your snare and then you mix your snare trigger and everything separately, you can kind of lose the plot a little bit. But when you're starting with mixing the drums as a whole, and then you work your way backwards and you're making your smaller adjustments at the channel level, it makes mixing a lot easier, which, like, I don't know, it took me a while to adopt this mixing approach, but now that I absolutely love it, and I'll never be going back to starting with just mixing the dry kick signal. You just get a much better sound in the end, in my opinion. And I hope that this video was helpful to you guys. Hopefully you picked up something that you can use in your own drum mixes to make them sound better. And if you haven't already, hit the like button, subscribe. It would really mean a lot to me, and I'll see you guys in the next one.